This is Toby Capwell, historian, author, and expert on medieval and Renaissance arms and armour. Today he's breaking down some of the weapons, armour, and inspirations found within the campaign of Space Marine 2. And it's fair to say Toby's become a bit of a fan of the franchise since we last checked out Warhammer 40,000.
Yay! Oh, I love this game so much more now. So are the Thousand Sons playable in this game, or are they just bad guys?
They're not playable now. They're the bad guys. Sorry to break it to you.
All right, well, hopefully that will be rectified in a downloadable expansion that you can play the Thousand Sons as the heroes they really are.
I can feel the comments already.
We've got another video of Toby checking out some of the multiplayer customizations, armor designs, and heretical war gear coming soon, so be sure to stay tuned for that. But without further ado, it's over to Toby.
You know, one of the things that I'm endlessly fascinated by with Warhammer 40k is how many kind of references and influences you're getting bombarded with every second. The sources of inspiration for this and the references to different aspects of not just sci-fi and fantasy, but real history and real historical art. It's just amazing to me that they can smash all of that together and it still works, you know? Like right here, you've got Space Marine in his armor, and the armor is really in its basic composition built like a real plate armor of the 15th or 16th centuries. I mean, in its essence, in how the body is broken down, how do those solid plates accommodate and facilitate the movement of the human body while giving you as much protection as possible? That's what they're doing here, and that's what they show you. You've got shoulder plates, enclosed upper and lower arms, you've got an articulated elbow, articulated knees. There's a lot that's recognizable as real armor here. But then you've got firearms, you've got ammunition. There's a lot of kind of industrial warfare as opposed to, you know, medieval or Renaissance warfare. There's a lot of industrial modern stuff here as well. Now, if I put my 15th century plate armor on and picked up an assault rifle, it wouldn't work. I mean, it'd be kind of hard for me to use it. You know, when you're in armor, you're slippery. So just like, you know, holding the gun and stabilizing it would be kind of hard, and it wouldn't work visually. It would look weird to people. So why does this work? The first thing that springs to mind is the religious element. The degree to which a knight regards himself not just as a military figure, but also a kind of religious representative. There's an inherent aspect of religious devotion to what he does. You know, he may have a military commander, but he is also in the service of higher powers. To some extent, the Space Marines behave like that. And yes, you know, I mean, punishment for cowardly behavior or treasonous behavior, that's certainly a historical thing. And in the wider kind of literature of knighthood, in Ivanhoe, Sir Walter Scott's great chivalric novel, Ivanhoe has been disinherited. You know, his father did not want him to go on the Crusades, but he went anyway, so he was disinherited. And when he comes back to England, he comes back in disguise. He has a shield that says Destacado on it, disinherited, and he has to prove himself kind of anonymously to regain his reputation, because he will not be accepted as himself until his deeds of valor are so stupendous that nobody can deny him. And that kind of idea goes all the way back to the real Middle Ages, certainly. Here, the kind of realization of the inscriptions and the decoration on the armor is very much a 40k style. But in essence, that's a very ancient idea too. There's plenty of real armor that has invocational or protective inscriptions on it, taken from passages in the Bible that are appropriate. Sometimes you have the person's name or just the repeating name of the Virgin Mary or Jesus on the armor. You know, again, they're doing it in their own way, but they're following some very authentic ideas. It's pretty amazing to actually see this in action. You know, 40k is a tabletop game. And if you're not looking at the miniatures, you're looking at pictorial artwork in the books and things. How often do you get to see it like this? And it really interesting to see how the Space Marine is a modern special forces soldier with, modern ranged weapons, but he's also got swords and shields and things. And in the combat, it's fascinating to see him switching back and forth. He has good firearms technique, and then he effortlessly gets the sword out. And to see the kind of body language of modern versus traditional weapons, just kind of switching effortlessly back and forth. Yeah, it's great. It's really amazing. People often say to me at, jousts and competitions and things, what would it be like if knights had firearms, grenades, and artillery and things? Here it is, basically. The accumulated gore on the armor is nice to see too. That's one thing that's historically been quite hard to address in movies that deal with knightly combat. Very quickly it looks too much. It makes that tip from reality into Monty Python very quickly. But in reality, we have historical accounts of knights totally covered in gore. If you've ever been to an emergency room or even got, a subtle cut on your head, for example, the blood just sprays everywhere and gets on everything. If you think about a medieval battle with people using edged weapons like that at close range, blood everywhere. There's an account in Philippe de Comines, a French chronicler who wrote a history of the Burgundian Wars in the 15th century. He describes the end of a battle where the Burgundian knights have gone back to their duke's tent, and they say he was so encrusted in the blood of his enemies that he was unrecognizable. Even when he walked up to them, they didn't know who he was. Pretty amazing. Another thing I love about 40K is how much the armor itself is a character. It's like a collective character that plays all kinds of roles. The figures live in their armor, they're defined by their armor. It's always there as an issue one way or another. To then see the character without his armor and the whole question of one's identity inside the armor, outside of the armor, the sense of vulnerability. Armor makes you feel powerful. It makes you feel invulnerable. It totally, when you put it on, it totally changes your mindset. You have a sense that you are now different. If you're fighting people who don't have armor, you can hurt them with any part of your body. You don't even need weapons. And that play on invulnerability versus vulnerability is something that, again, is always resonating in 40K. And you see it in this scene really nicely, where they contrast the hero. He hasn't taken his armor off, somebody else has, right? And that's immediately kind of disorienting and inappropriate. And then you have this figure waiting to welcome him back. A very overt representative of the religious side of a knightly culture. And in reality, you have all kinds of things in real medieval history that are like the 40K chaplains. You have the obvious things like the military orders of knighthood, most famously the Templar order, which is sort of half knight and half monk. But beyond the military orders, you also have examples of actual priests, bishops, for example, in Germany especially, in the High Middle Ages, would often lead their own armies into battle. And they wear armor, they wear the bishop's mitres on their helmets. It's just like this. I really love how this game has made the Space Marine armor seem really, really plausible. They've had to make this very substantial leap from little wargame miniatures and pictorial art to something that looks real. And that's a massive leap. How do we show the armor so it really looks like there's a body inside it? When it moves, you can almost see through the armor to the body inside. And when they're making wargame figures and action figures and things, or paintings and drawings, they don't really have to worry so much of that. They're working in a more stylized medium. You look at the history of 40K art, it can be very stylized. The old stuff is way far out, and that's what I sort of love about it. But here, they have to make it look real. You can also get a wonderful sense of what's going on underneath the armor plates. That's what you never see, and what you can often not think about. An armor only works if it's got the right undergarments set up in the right way for what you're wearing. Like the muscles and ligaments under the exoskeleton of a lobster or something like that. And 40k has a long history of defining what's under a Space Marine's armor. The artificial muscles, fiber bundles, all of that. But again, on a static figure, you don't really get much of a sense of that. But here, you see it around the character's throat, you see it when they move. You get a sense of that integrated system, that some of which you can see, some of which you can't. None of this armor would work without that artificial musculature inside. It's too big, it's too heavy. The only reason they can decorate, they have the luxury to decorate themselves by wrapping chains around themselves, is because their strength is so much greater, artificially, mechanically augmented. If it was me on the jousting field wrapping chains around myself, I'd be immediately putting too much extra weight onto myself. I'd be paying too much of a physical cost for something that really has no function. But because of their augmented strength, they can do decorative things that wouldn't be possible in reality. I love seeing that they pursue to the hilt the implications of what they're presenting. I feel a kind of empathy with the designers, the producers of this game, because in their effort to move from sculpture and drawing, they have to get to a physical reality. What is all that art referring to? What is the source of that? And that's exactly what I have to do in, when I'm doing historical martial arts, jousting. I need a complete, totally functional armor that works like it did in August of 1485 or whatever. What are we left with now? We work again from sculptures and pictorial art and a few fragments of real armor surviving now, but looking often nothing like what they did when they were new. The game designers are kind of going through the same process as what I have done for the last 30 years in trying to build real armor for, combat and competition. There's a guy mopping up back there. I love that. Somebody has to clean the ship. It's great. People often forget, when they look at knights. There's so much Arthurian literature, chivalric literature, where knights are the focus, and this individual rides his horse off into the forest and has an adventure by himself. But in reality, armored warriors need a team of people to make and maintain all of their equipment, to assist them with caring for their horse. It's easy to forget all the people who make it happen, make the night happen. Often in my work, I'm at pains to remind everybody of that, real context, your horse attendants, your footmen, your squires. It's nice to see that in here, that there's a guy who has to mop up in the back. And also the size difference. The Mechanicum adepts are more like the size of an ordinary human, and suddenly you see how much bigger the Space Marines actually are. That fundamental relationship between your technology and your religion, from at least the 12th century, the knights' armor and equipment had religious significance. And the sword, especially, the sword is a symbol of God's power on earth. And when a knight wields his sword, he's showing that he is the wielder of that divine favor and power. And that has real on-the-ground benefits. If his enemies believe that of him, he has a psychological advantage and dominance. And again, that's something that they've always understood in 40k.
We serve him with our bodies.
They're kneeling. Kneeling in armor is possible. It's one of these things that can get very difficult very quickly if your armor isn't quite right, especially with the enclosed upper legs and lower legs. Sometimes, those plates can hit each other before your knee is fully flexed, so you wouldn't be able to kneel in an armor. Regardless of your mobility, if the plates hit each other and lock up, they can prevent movement. But I love seeing a bunch of them kneeling and having a church service before they go. That's great.
My lord! Major Sarkana, 8th Cadian Regiment.
Major, give me an update.
Seeing some of the social relationships there on the battlefield between the knights or the Space Marines and the common soldiers is really interesting too. It's like things that are conceptual in reality are manifested physically in 40k. Like a knight is more skillful, he's better trained, he may be in better physical condition, he's got better weapons than common soldiers, but he's not generally physically monstrous compared to them. But in the game, I love that literalization of so many concepts that have to do with knights in the Middle Ages in 40k. He's a more powerful, higher ranking character, so he's physically a lot bigger. You can see how that would work on, when this comes from a tabletop game, it has to work on a tabletop with all these little figures. You need to immediately see who's who, where are they? Oh, that guy's got the big spiky, sun on the top of his pack. You can see it works in a tabletop, but it's kind of neat to see how it works in a totally different media as well, because the underpinnings are right.
I think we touched on this maybe last time we looked at some 40k stuff, but to the average soldier, this is like seeing an angel.
Right, but in reality, it would be like that too. You think a common person in the Middle Ages, what do they see in their everyday life? They have a world that's, it probably has more color than we give it credit for, but not a lot of super bright color, not a lot of super high polished metal. It's a world lit only by fire, as the historian William Manchester was famous for saying. And then you see these knights who are mirror polished, they're reflecting the light of the sun, they've probably got gilding on their armor. That has a divine effect, and it's intended to in reality. So again, they're quite right to pick up on that.
I don't know if this resonates with you, but the colour of the lieutenant's helmet is sort of like the red plume of a Roman centurion's helmet.
Right, and then there are other Ultramarines commanders who wear the actual Roman crests. The Ultramarines have always reveled in that Roman inspiration, which is quite fun because it's not the first time that a later civilization has modeled themselves on the Roman example. In the 15th and 16th centuries, knights were doing exactly the same thing, connecting themselves and modeling themselves on the Roman example. That is what the Renaissance was, right? The rediscovering of classical and specifically Roman culture. That Renaissance is just happening again in a certain corner of the 40k universe. They have a lot of, Roman details, but they're not dressing up as historical Romans any more than, the Renaissance was interested in dressing up like real Romans. It's intensely contemporary. This is artwork and fashion at the same time as it's technology. And if your aesthetic is Roman, but your technology is different, it leads again to a totally original appearance. And that's something 40k does really well. They take inspiration from everywhere. There's the Ultramarine chapter that are, medieval in the 14th century somewhere, and there's the Roman guys, and there's the Greek guys, and anything you care to mention is there somewhere. But it also has its own aesthetic, its own integrity. They're not historical reenactors. Their use of these little jousting shields, these are derived from jousting shields of the 15th century. I've always been a little perplexed by their presence in 40k. It's again one of these slightly odd things that shouldn't work but somehow does. You see it has its inner corner cut out. On a real jousting shield, that's to allow for the lance. Your shield is in front there, but your lance might want to come across the body if you're striking someone passing on your left. So cutting out the shield gives the lance a little more room to traverse. The Space Marines aren't using lances like that. It's kind of funny they still have the cutout though. And sometimes they have their jousting shield on the other side, but they still have the cutout on the same side, so it's on the outside, which looks a bit odd. But they've set that up. They've explained that in 40k because they've already established people in this distant future have an awareness of traditional human culture, very detailed awareness of all kinds of aspects of M1 or whatever they call it. But it's a flawed awareness. They're aware of some playwright named Shakespeare. You know, I love that, because that's what happens. If we sit here and look back to the 15th century, we're looking at it through a series of distorting lenses. We don't have an unobstructed view. Then, you know, Hollywood gets in our way. 19th century medievalism gets in our way. The 18th century Enlightenment, you know, creates the concept of the Middle Ages for their own contemporary 18th century purposes. So, you know, the past is a changeable thing, and in 40,000 years, they've had time to get some pretty weird ideas about things. So I don't care that their jousting shields are weird and not being used for jousting, and that they've got the cutouts on the wrong side, because they don't fully understand what they're doing. I love that. There's a lot of nice damage on the armor now. You know, real armor accrues damage over time, and the damage tells a story. If you're in a completely perfect, pristine armor, what does that say? To knowledgeable people, certainly to other knights, it says you've never done anything in your life. The dents and the scratches and the scars are badges of honor, and I think the Space Marines wear that proudly. Painted armor is super, super common, almost ubiquitous in 40K. The endless parade of colors and color combinations, which is, again, you know, one of the wonderful things about, you know, the painting and, you know, the different identities the chapters have. Painted armor in reality was a thing. It did happen, but paint is easily scratched and chipped off, but they're showing you that. That's something where the game can really show you more of that than what you can see on a little figure. They've really taken stock of what they can contribute. What can they do in this game that couldn't be done on the tabletop or in a book illustration?
Kill them!
Yay! Oh, I love this game so much more now. These guys are my heroes. You know, people often say to me, like online, or they often assume that I'll be a Grey Knights fan. You know, I have a certain professional regard for the Grey Knights, but my real devotion stands firmly with the Thousand Sons. I love everything about them.
What made me laugh is since we first looked at Warhammer, and then you started getting into Warhammer, and you're like, oh, I might, you know, I'll read the Horus Heresy, I'll get into the figures. Yeah. The first ones you picked up were the Thousand Sons, which are well known in the Warhammer community as being some of the most annoying to paint, but you went right in at the deep end. It
was really funny how it happened. I really got into Warhammer by just wanting to help my kids. A couple of years ago, a new little independent game shop opened up where I live in Woodbridge in Suffolk. Aardvarks and Dragons. Great place. My older son started going in there and gotten into it, and he wanted to paint stuff. And when he was first starting out, when he's like, I don't know, 8 years old, I take him in and he's painting Ultramarines, but I thought, I should do this too. We should do this together. Who am I gonna paint? And I just immediately went for the Thousand Sons, looking at the shelf. I just thought, I love the whole Egyptian thing. And I just picked them only because I needed some miniatures to paint with my son. I knew nothing. I hadn't read anything. I knew nothing. I just went for the pure visual aesthetic of them. And then later you find out more about them and how they're academics as well as soldiers, and that appeals to me. You know, they're obsessed with learning things, and knowledge is power. You know, it speaks to me. What can I say? So are the Thousand Sons playable in this game, or are they just bad guys?
They're not playable now. They're the bad guys. Sorry to break it to you.
All right, well, okay. So this game obviously has a very strong and distinct Space Marine bias here, or Imperium bias. Hopefully that will be rectified in a subsequent downloadable expansion, that you can play the Thousand Sons as the heroes they really are.
I can feel the comments already.
The design of the Thousand Sons screams Egyptian. And there's a couple of things you can point to that make people recognize that. And they've got these big crests behind their heads, referring to Egyptian royal or pharaonic headdresses. And the color combination too of the yellow and this sort of very distinctive light blue color, which is the typical color of a particular kind of ancient Egyptian fired ceramic that they make all sorts of beads and sculptures and jewelry and all kinds of things out of. It's called faience, and it's this very distinctive blue fired ceramic material. There's 1,000 Suns blue paint for a reason, because that particular blue works on your collective imagination in a particular way. There's not a lot that's genuinely Egyptian on them, but it's amazing how if you take a couple of key motifs, it'll just flick people's imagination in a particular way. You can really see the effort, physically, the effort he has to put into pulling someone's helmet off, for example. That's nice. That's very tactile. And then he's had to strike his knife with his other hand to, again, give you a sense of what's involved in punching through armor plate. And that's something, again, we see on historical weapons. You know, the garden variety rondel dagger, typical knightly sidearm, as a disc, a steel or iron disc to guard the front of the hand. And then it's got another disc on the back, so the hand is really supported and embraced. But that rear disc, you know, you often see the hand placed on that and then the leaning in with the body weight to puncture, you know, a skull or something like that. King Richard III was famously killed in that way, or something like that way. He has a stab wound from a knife that goes from the base of his skull all the way through his head to the point that you can see the point hit the skull on the interior, on the other side of his head. And that's someone doing something very similar, probably. Again, another knightly weapon historically, the pole axe or pole hammer. Very skillfully made staff weapons are another badge of historical knighthood. A long-hafted weapon like that, big swings like that, as you can see, very effective against multiple enemies. Those kind of big movements are the only way you can kind of control several opponents at the same time.
I sent 2 squads to move on the enemy's flank, but we've lost contact with them. They are carrying the company standard. If they have fallen,
we will retrieve it, Captain.
This bit here, they're talking about the company standard having potentially been lost, which I know is like a huge thing in Roman history as well.
Yeah, and medieval history. In medieval France, the oriflamme, the royal banner, was defended to the death. Famous knight, Geoffrey de Charny, who wrote books. He was a literary, educated fellow, and he was also the first owner of the Shroud of Turin, interestingly. Kind of an antiquarian, as well as a warrior, as well as an author. He was killed at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, defending the oriflamme banner. They only get it out of your cold, dead hand, right? It's not like some weird, you know, religious thing. It has a firmly practical basis. You know, on a medieval battlefield, you don't have radios, you don't have radar, GPS. You can only know where your commanders are and where your captains are and what is the whole disposition of your army on the basis of the banners. And if a banner falls down, it immediately impacts communication and awareness, but it also can have a catastrophic impact on morale. If a king's banner falls down, you can quite reasonably assume the king himself has just been killed. Even if it's just uncertainty in an army, even if it's just doubt, that can finish a battle for you. The kind of dedication of carrying banners and guarding banners, whatever the cost, make sure that banner doesn't fall down. That's not like some knightly ideal, that's an inherent practicality that then gets elaborated with a lot of ideals and ritual. But the ritual is based in practicality. Oh yes, Dreadnought fight.
where are the traitors?
I really love the whole idea of dreadnoughts. You know, the typical Space Marine is already a massive exaggeration of some basic physical ideas and principles. taking the idea of the knight, giving him gunpowder weapons, and then turning it up to 11. You wouldn't have thought the armor could get any bigger or stronger. And then the Dreadnought shows up, and it's like a whole nother level of exaggeration. In the little bit of reading and things I've done, the Dreadnoughts also are often some of the most interesting characters. Terribly wounded warriors who've been put in, now their armor is literally keeping them alive in every way, not just against attack. It's a life support system as well as protection. Considering the mental state of someone in that position is really interesting to someone like me who has spent a lot of time in armor. I've felt the armor protect me, but what would it be like if you could never take it off? You don't have a body anymore. You're a brain stuck in a giant armor. This is very interesting.
That abomination is mine! In the name of the Emperor, I cast you down!
Well, I can see why this game took so long, but I do hope that everybody thinks it was worth the wait, because it sure looks amazing to me. I played games as a kid, when I was in high school, when I was in college, all the way up to the point when I started doing my PhD about 20 years ago. I played games, and then I stopped because I couldn't afford the time anymore. I was doing my PhD. I was, doing my PhD at the same time as I had a full-time job. There wasn't a lot of time, and I just had to make a decision to stop playing. And I haven't played really at all since in the last 20 years. This sort of makes me want to play it, actually, though.
We need to get you a PS5.
I'm sure my children would agree with you.
Thank you so much for watching. Remember to comment below what other games you'd like to see on the show, and be sure to subscribe for more content like this and beyond.